I may well have made this video before along these lines, but I don't mind because I think I want to really emphasize the point, and I'll be editing my videos at a later time anyway, so I'll keep whichever one has more views, whatever. But I do think it's very important to highlight this issue. There's one boxing match which for me highlights more than many others the very, very ugly side of the fan base. And it's sort of, I always try and explain that with boxing I have a sort of love-hate relationship. It's very, very hard to explain to non-boxing fans, and actually to other boxing fans as well, because unfortunately it seems to be a minority of boxing fans who have my line of thinking. Maybe not a minority, but let's just say the people who would not go along exactly with my thinking are a very vocal side of the boxing fan base. So I think people who take my stance need to be more vocal about it. Basically the issue is this: it is about how this sport can desensitize fans to an extent whereby they're bordering on sadistic. I'll put a link to the video I'm talking about. In the year 2000, one of Mike Tyson's last fights was against a Polish-American fighter called Andrew Golota. Pretty good contender. Well, basically, the fight didn't last very long at all. In the first round and the second round, Golota was clearly distressed and telling his corner he wanted to quit. In the second round, he made a very dramatic decision and he did quit. Like that. His corner were furious. They were trying to tell him, don't do this, don't do this, don't effing do this. The referee was stunned. Tyson wasn't happy. But the ugliest reaction of all came from the crowd. They started booing, which is bad enough, but then it got really ugly, and as Andrew Golota was leaving the venue, can't remember where it was, I think it wasn't Vegas, it was somewhere else, but as he was leaving the venue, Detroit, I think, you know, he actually got pelted by things, and he saw, I don't know if it was beer or water or whatever it was. At one point some red liquid landed on him, and it was just very, very ugly scenes. Tyson left, presumably to defuse things. Tyson wasn't happy because obviously he wanted to go the distance. But this was a very depressing situation. Now, immediately the commentators, without even thinking about it, called Golota a card. And I thought that was very unprofessional. An interviewer afterwards spoke to Golota. That was a bit more of a neutral interview, tried to get his opinion across. Golota was sort of slurring his words, not so much because of his broken English, but he was clearly quite distressed. Well, it turned out what later happened was he had some serious problems health-wise in that fight, and it turned out that Andrew Golota didn't fight again for another 3 years. So what we had there was a situation of a man who made a decision that's extremely rare in boxing, in professional boxing, a fighter actually quitting a fight and walking out. Now, I honestly believe a man like Andrew Golota, an experienced professional boxer, would not do that without a very, very sincere reason for doing so in his own mind. I believe Andrew Golota, I think it's a lot of nonsense that he was scared. I think that's a lot of rubbish, because if you're a professional boxer, it's not like it was Golota's first fight. That might be an argument if it was his first ever fight, but a man who's already had lots of fights isn't going to react to fear from entering a ring. That just is nonsensical. So I just don't buy that it was fear that made him do that. I mean, for one thing, if it was, then psychologically he's not fit for the sport. And the point is, when a professional boxer enters into a boxing match, he or she is approved by a boxing board of control. That includes, probably not as much as it should, but does include if the fight is stable enough to enter a ring. Although maybe there should be more focus on a mental health perspective. But anyway, that wasn't the issue in that fight. I believe it was much more a practical health issue. I believe Andrew Golota actually feared for his life there. I believe he was arguing that Tyson had headbutted him, and it looked like he was shaken up. And let's be clear, Andrew Golota is no shrinking violet. He's not a soft man. This is a tough guy we're talking about. So clearly it took a drastic feeling for him to make that decision. And I actually would argue it was just as brave for him to do that than to enter the ring, because he knew, making that decision, no one would back him. He knew his corner would be against him, he knew the referee would not like it, he knew his opponent would not like it, and especially the crowd. Now, that took courage to make that decision. So when I see fans, even to this day, disrespecting Andrew Golota, it makes my blood boil, because they cannot be open-minded now enough to consider why he done that. And this is what it comes down to. You're weighing up a $49 ticket. That's what the interviewer quoted it was. $49, $49.50, with potentially a man's life. And just in case anyone thinks that's an exaggeration, I would point to the case of, this is featured in Ring Magazine, and this is what made me look it up. Now, this was a recent incident. I believe a Russian fighter, Magomed Abdusalamov. Not sure what nationality he is, but that's beside the point. Basically, he ended up in a coma in a fight in New York City last year, I believe. He's now in a permanent coma. And that fight, there was no obvious. There's a long article about that, and they have medical opinion. To be fair to the Ring, they do go into details with these things. The Ring Magazine, to its credit, doesn't gloss this over. They do report it. They go into details about it. Not long ago, they had another report about a British fighter who had something like 200 fights, and he lost most of them. Now that was, obviously that's not the same as Andrew Golota. That was a fighter who's clearly not very skilled. But that was arguing about a mental health perspective. Now, I honestly believe, as a fan, I believe there needs to be much, much, much more support given to fighters from a mental health perspective. I'm not saying that there's none of it. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist. But I believe that it's something that's massively overlooked. And it makes my blood boil when I see fans that are so... Sometimes they act like they literally want to see a man die for their entertainment. And that just, to me, is... I knew when I got interested in the sport, I knew it was tough. I knew that men get injured, and I'd be a hypocrite if I said I didn't want violence involved in it. I don't expect these guys to pat each other. I expect violence, I expect good shots, etc. But I never, ever, ever want to see it get to a point where a man is seriously injured. And a lot of fighters themselves will say that. They will say they do not want to do that to their opponent. You get big mouths in this sport who will talk about wanting to seriously injure their opponent, and sometimes that's for hype. But most fighters, I believe, do not want to do that. And I believe a lot of fans don't want it either. Unfortunately, there's a lot of fans as well who honestly believe that their entertainment is more important than the man's life. And I can't comprehend that way of thinking. And they'll say, oh well, you're not a real fan because you don't have the same passion as we do. That's not true. I wouldn't have followed the sport for years if I was so disgusted that I was put off by it. I just wouldn't follow at all. Why would I spend £5 in Ring Magazine if I hate the sport? So if they say I'm not a real fan, they're full of shit, because I've invested a lot of money in my interest in the sport. Hell, I'm trying to be an amateur fighter myself. Why on earth would I subject myself to that if I was... I just think there needs to be some candidness in the sport about these sort of issues. And I think there needs to be a situation whereby if a fighter... Obviously, if a fighter is scared, then he or she shouldn't be in the ring. And that is their problem. It's something they need to get over, and they should know themselves. No one forces them to do it, so they shouldn't put themselves in that position. But I honestly don't think that was the case in the Golota fight, and I'll put a link so you can judge for yourselves. I really, really don't believe that was the case. That's why I believe there should be some sort of situation whereby there is some people in that place, in the venue, who have the humanity to support a fighter in those situations. Clearly, Golota did not have a humane corner, because they were not prepared to listen to him. They were only interested in getting their payday. They didn't want to listen to the concerns of their fighter. And as far as I'm concerned, if they were a professional corner, they would have said, what's going on? Why do you want to do this? Maybe Golota should have been a bit more clear about why he was doing it, rather than just, maybe he should have done that, like explained it a bit more. But I refuse to believe that he'd done that out of fear. Of course he would be frightened to enter the ring, that's human nature, but I refuse to believe that it was fear enough to make him leave the ring. I believe he left the ring because he believed that he had some serious injury that would have only got worse and worse and worse. That was only round 2. So if he believed it was bad at that round, if that's a 12-round fight, he's probably thinking in his mind, I could be dead at the end of this fight. Literally dead. Now every fighter goes into a boxing ring not naive, expecting maybe some injury. But no fighter goes in expecting to die. Now Andrew Golota, I believe, really believed that may have been the case. So he took a drastic decision. He knew that it would be, he would have to withstand the few minutes that it was of vitriol and animalistic behaviour, but I suspect that maybe he looks back and thinks that he made the right decision. And I believe any real fans, if you're a real Andrew Golota fan, then you would support him and recognise why he done that. Unfortunately, in the boxing world, some fans don't give a shit about the fighters. They really don't. They only care about the cost of their ticket and their entertainment. Now, I can understand fans being frustrated if they have paid money and a fight ends early on a controversial decision or something like that. I can understand that. Okay, I'm not oblivious to that fact. But for them to be so, like, I mean, that crowd was behaving like hyenas. It made me sick, to be honest, watching it. And this isn't a unique incident. There was another situation in Australia. Unfortunately, I can't remember the fighters' names. One of them was someone green. I'm afraid I don't know every single fighter in boxing. I don't pretend that I do. But that was another similar incident. And in that situation, the guy's opponent verbally lambasted him, and the crowd again, they booed the guy out of the ring. It was very hard to watch. And I'm not overly sensitive. This is a tough sport. I mean, just before this, I've watched the Andre Ward-Saki Obika fight. I enjoyed that fight. It was great. Good fight. Tough fight. So it's not a case of being too sensitive. I just think that as fans, there needs to be some limits as to what fans expect. And they need to consider that if a fighter does this, there must be an underlying reason for it. Now I know probably those fans weren't thinking clearly, they probably were reacting on the spot, but the decent ones among them would have looked in retrospect and thought, well, actually, maybe we were wrong to boo him, maybe there was a legitimate concern there. And the scumbags among them would have no regrets, because that's what they are. They have no human compassion whatsoever. This is a brutal sport, but doesn't mean that you have to be a sadist to follow it. And quite honestly, as a boxing fan, I find it very hard to legitimise boxing when fellow fans have this sort of attitude. I find it very hard to condone the sport to non-boxing fans when I don't blame them for having a bad image of the sport when they see the way fans behave. I mean, that fight was 14 years ago, but I think the issues are still relevant. Sadly, I don't think it will be the end of this time something like this happens. And I just think the sport really, really needs to clean up. I know you can't completely reform it, but I honestly believe boxing needs to treat its fans the same way as what football done to its fans. What I mean by that is those fans who bring nothing to the sport, who disrespect fighters to the point of throwing things at them. Now, why on earth were there not arrests made for those people who were hurling objects at Andrew Golota as he left the ring. Why not? People will say, oh, they had a right to be angry, but they're not children, they're adults. And a responsible adult doesn't express anger in that way. So as far as I'm concerned, the so-called fans that done that should have been arrested. And you might say, oh well, he's a boxer, he can take anything. That's not true. You could be the toughest boxer in the world. It doesn't mean that you're a robot. Boxers are tough men, but they're not robots. So it's just a few issues to think about. And I don't care if I'm in a minority here. I believe that it takes sincere boxing fans to acknowledge this. I believe I am a sincere boxing fan because I care about the fighters. I understand the risks these men take, and I respect those risks. And I never ever call any fighter a bum or a card. Ever. And if you do, you need to really look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, are you a real boxing fan?